Good morning, everyone. This is Nathan Lindorf with The Rational Independent. I am a resident of Colorado, and so I suppose it's time for me to take a quick look at the brewing slow motion catastrophe that is going on in Colorado with its Supreme Court. Basically, to catch you up in case you've been living under a rock, earlier this week, the state Supreme Court in Colorado ruled that because Donald Trump committed an insurrection, he was ineligible to be placed on the ballot. Now, a few details just to be mindful and aware. The case was brought by a handful of voters, 4 Republicans and 2 independents. Now, for those of you who also might just have not been paying attention, there are a lot of Republicans who don't like Trump. The case was initially brought by a handful of voters, carried through a couple of different state jurisdictions, ending up with the Supreme Court and with its ruling. Now, the interesting thing is, basically, here we are a few days before Christmas, and the ruling says that the Supreme Court of the United States has until January 4th or 5th to weigh in on the case, or else they're going to print the ballots and, it'll be, the ship will have sailed. So for those of you who are skeptical of lawfare, think about what's going on here. A state is trying to dictate to the feds that their time frame for responding to this brand new constitutional issue that's being created, there's no precedent here, is 2 weeks over the course of 2 major holidays where most of the world is shutting down right now. Friendly bit of advice: if you're looking to make good decisions in life, try not to make them in a hurry. Trying to do this over the holidays is a little bonkers. So we've got a couple of articles to touch on today because this is a multifaceted issue, but let's dive into it. The first one being from PBS. PBS, Colorado Supreme Court bans Trump from the state's ballot under the Constitution's insurrection clause. The Colorado Supreme Court declared former president ineligible for the White House under the U.S. Constitution's insurrection clause and removed him from the state's presidential primary ballot. Now, I haven't read the ruling, but I've heard some commentary on it that indicates that he would also be disallowed as a write-in candidate on the general, setting up a likely showdown with the nation's highest court. The decision from a court whose justices were all appointed by Democratic governors marks the first time in history that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment has been used to disqualify a presidential candidate. So again, this is a constitutional issue. This is the first time a court is applying the Constitution's provision here for barring an insurrectionist from office. Well, from the presidency specifically. That's worth weighing carefully, not rush 2 weeks at the end of a year, whatever. Colorado's highest court overturned the initial ruling from a district court judge, and the district court judge had an interesting ruling. He said, yes, Trump incited an insurrection for his role on January 6, 2021. But he could not be barred from the presidency because the provision of the Constitution for Section 3 of Article 14, or Amendment 14, is a little vague in its wording about whether or not it includes the presidency. It's a technical reason to say, yeah, he did it, but I can't remove him. And the Supreme Court said, well, yeah, you can remove him. We do not reach these conclusions lightly. We are mindful of the magnitude and weight of the questions now before us, which makes the timing interesting because you're trying to rush the decision. Trump's attorneys had promised to appeal any disqualification. Personally, to my mind, anytime I hear Trump's attorneys are going to do something quickly, I don't have a lot of confidence. I have not been impressed with the level of legal action taken by those lawyers employed by Donald Trump. They don't have a great track record. Colorado officials say the issue must be settled by January 5th, the deadline for the state to print its presidential primary ballots. Dozens of lawsuits have been filed nationally to disqualify him. This is the one that's furthest along. Colorado case is the first where the plaintiff succeeded. The state's highest court didn't agree with the district court, siding with the attorneys for 6 Colorado Republican and unaffiliated voters, who argued it was nonsensical to imagine the framers of the amendment, fearful of former Confederates returning to power, would bar them from low-level offices, but not the highest one in the land. You'd be saying a rebel who took up arms against the government couldn't be a county sheriff, could be the president. Attorney Jason Murray said in arguments before the court in early December. I'm going to go ahead and just pause here real quick, because at the heart of this is J6, January 6th. at the heart of this constitutional kerfuffle is the idea that Donald Trump committed and fomented and led, and whatever verb you want to throw in there, an insurrection on January 6th. Look at the argument from the attorney trying to convince the court that that's what happened. A rebel who took up arms against the government. You're saying the sitting president who said some words and maybe didn't act as proactively as he probably should have to try and squash the actions of people at the Capitol is the equivalent of a rebel who took up arms. One of the reasons why January 6th was not an insurrection. And I'd love to hear a counter argument. I haven't heard a good one yet. No one brought any weapons. They had the guy with horns and war paint. They had people with flags on staffs. There were improvised weapons that were used based on what was found, which is not okay. But if you are trying to make the case that Donald Trump was trying to overthrow the government by force of arms, literally in the argument from the attorney, trying to get him off the ballot, he says the example, the constitutional example, is a rebel who took up arms against the government. That's the standard. That's their standard. That's the constitutional standard. And then you're saying January 6th, the protesters didn't bring any weapons. Donald Trump didn't call for violence. How is this an armed insurrection that allows you to categorize Donald Trump as a rebel who took up arms against his government and is therefore disqualified? It's hogwash, but you can get away with it because it has not been tried in court. It's been tried in the court of public opinion. And when you have the drumbeat narrative effect of mainstream media, you can get a whole bunch of people around the idea that what you think happened is different than what actually happened. So let's look at, first off, there's no excuse for this. I'm just gonna throw this out there as a nice disclaimer. There's another one on Reddit. Colorado Secretary of State, extremely concerned about pro-Trump violence. She's received dozens of death threats and hundreds of threats of abuse since the court case was filed to keep Trump off the state ballot. Jenna Griswold is the Secretary of State. She is part of the Democratic administration of the state of Colorado, where I live. Her job is to follow the law and conduct the election. She has nothing to do with this. Even for people who have something to do with this, death threats are not okay. Threats of violence, not okay. I am as close to a free speech absolutist as you'll find. One of the carve-outs, one of the only carve-outs, is when you call for violence against a person. That's not speech. That is a call to action where you want to harm somebody. You're taking it out of the realm of speech. You can say you should be fired. You can say don't do this. You can say you should resign. You could... Civil discourse is as broad as you want to do it. You can call her every nasty name in the book and it won't faze me one bit. If you call for violence against this person, I can't go there with you. It's not free speech. It's wrong. Don't do it. And of course, because we need to keep things spicy, Republicans threatened to take Joe Biden off of ballots in states they control. So do you think we're going to have a legitimate electoral contest if the Democratic Party's nominee is only on a handful of states and the Republicans' nominee is on a handful of other states? Any chance that's leading us anywhere good? No, it's not leading us anywhere good. It's leading us bad. I don't like this kind of partisan bickering. It's not helpful. It's this idea of fighting fire with fire. And the reason why that idea falls on its face is simply this. There are a lot of people that I follow on the right and within Republican establishment circles, or some of the more libertarian or kind of non-traditional right-leaning people, who basically say, look at how the left abandons the rule of law, abandons civil society, abandons the norms of behavior, and will use every lever of power that they have to try and basically win by any means necessary. Lie, cheat, steal, whatever. And then they call and say, okay, the way that we fight that is do the same thing to them. Here's the problem. If you understand that the leftists are motivated by Marxism, they are motivated by a desire to create a totalitarian state that enforces equality of outcome. That's communism in a nutshell. They want the destruction of our civil society. So therefore they are willing to abandon those norms because it helps them achieve their goals. if they win. If they lose, if you come down to their level and fight them with the same terms. Now, both sides have abandoned our society and the underpinnings that keep America free. And you slide into a dictatorship. And the Marxists know, once we do that, our main defense against the destruction they have planned for us is gone. The main defense against Marxist destructive tendencies is a population that believes in a civil society, even if they lose electorally, who believes in the principles espoused in the Constitution, things like freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, etc., for privacy, freedom to be secure in your own person or papers, freedom from cruel and unusual punishment, from being forced to use your home to quarter soldiers. We have to live in a society that still upholds those ideals. Even if the other side tries to undercut and abandon them, we don't protect those ideals by abandoning them ourselves. I think there are major legal issues with the Colorado court ruling, but it accomplishes nothing for Republicans to say, well, you did that to us, so we're going to do that to you. You poked out our eye, so we're going to poke out your eye. That's not going to take us anywhere good. And great, you get some points as a Republican for calling for Texas to remove him or whatever. It's no good. Now, let's just briefly discuss this. Colorado court ruling. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I just pay attention and I like to think things through. Here are some concerns that I have with this ruling. One, you are broaching new constitutional grounds. So you're asking the nation to accept a new standard of behavior, because the way jurisprudence works is the first time you make a decision on a new emerging issue, you create precedent. That precedent is then factored into future rulings, so that precedent needs to be as good and sound as possible. So if you are broaching a new constitutional issue, you should have the time to deal with that. They're saying that not only do Trump's lawyers have very little time, like their Christmas is gone, forget it. Not only do they have very little time to respond, they're demanding that the Supreme Court abide by Colorado's deadline of January 4th. They're saying the Supreme Court needs to weigh in on this and consider it in a ridiculously tight time frame. For those of you lucky enough to have never been involved in litigation, 2 weeks isn't even the typical time given for discovery or to give a response to a motion. It's far less than the typical window to appeal a ruling. So if you are involved in litigation and the court provides a ruling, you can appeal that. The typical window for appealing that is measured in months, if not years. In other words, you could tell the court, listen, we're going to appeal this. And they'll say, perfect, you've got 90 days, you've got 180 days, whatever, to craft your appeal arguments. And then it's handed off to the next court. And that court might wait till it's next in session. Might take months to decide they're even going to take up that appeal. Or they're going to deny and say, no, we're not going to touch that appeal. That's the typical appeals process. That's how this works. You are not supposed to do this sort of thing this quickly. So the timeline is a problem. And it's a problem on purpose. You want to rush a miracle, you get rotten miracles. They're trying to rush this decision in an effort to get something through that they know in a time with cooler heads and no time pressure has no chance of succeeding. Now, why doesn't it have a chance of succeeding? A couple of things. You're trying to flow upstream. I'll keep it G. You're trying to force the river to go back upstream. You can't do that. Our federated society, because we're not a democracy, we are a republic. And one of the reasons we have so many problems is because we have restructured parts of our republic so that we look less like a republic. I'll give you a classic example, okay? Senators. The way the Constitution was designed, the senators do not represent the people of their state. They represent the state as embodied by the state legislature. What does that mean? Well, it's simply this. The idea is at the federal level, you have the House of Representatives, direct proportional representation based on population, and you have that balanced by the Senate. The Senate is populated by 2 people from each state. So in other words, it's the states, the member states of the Union, it's their voice at a federal level. And the way that it is their voice is that up until the 16th Amendment, I forget the amendment, up until the early 1900s, back when Woodrow Wilson started ruining everything, up until the early 1900s, senators were appointed by their state legislature. In other words, within your state, you elected representatives to your state house, your state legislature, okay? And your state legislature sent senators to Congress. So it's still representative, but it is more directly structured so that each state has a voice at a federal level. And we said, you know what? States don't really need a voice. Let's just have them be elected by the people of their state. That's more democratic. It weakens our republic. It removes one of the checks and balances that were carefully constructed when the United States was formed. So that's an example. Now, because we live in a federated republic, okay, that means we have member states that all subordinate their local rule to the rules of the federal government. That way you can't have meth heads in one state building chemical weapons that are then get shipped in unregulated containers through the next member state over. You need someone to adjudicate that kind of crazy behavior and say, no, you can't do that. So the member states subordinate, they say within our boundaries, we get to do more or less what we want to do. But in regards to things that affect other members, in regards to things like interstate travel, etc., we need to understand that we need to play within a broad set of rules. So the precedent, the general structure is the federal government has a federal level of enforcement and statutes and officers that have global authority within the states, which means that if you have a law in an individual state that is overruled by a federal law, the federal law takes precedent. That's why all of you people who smoke marijuana right now should be reminded it's still illegal at a federal level. Even if your state has legalized it, what that means is that a state cop can't arrest you. But if the FBI wants to mess with you, they can. Law's still on the books. They can enforce it anytime they want. The fact that the prosecutorial arms of the federal government have basically said, we're going to defer and we're not going to pursue drug crimes that are against federal statute, that's a sign of corruption to me. But the law's still on the books. They can enforce it whenever they want. Just friendly warning. But that's how that works, okay? You have tiers. And what we're doing is we're basically having a member state of this federated arrangement trying to push their policy up to the federal level. They're trying to dictate at a state level what the federal government should do. And it gets a little even weirder than that, because they're not even trying to enact a state level policy. They are citing constitutional standards, the federal constitutional standards, not the state constitution, because each state has its own constitution. They are citing federal constitution standards, i.e. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, in regards to the precedent being the Civil War, which didn't even involve Colorado, let's just put it that way, saying that a person who is not a resident of Colorado is ruled to have violated a federal statute, i.e. insurrection against the federal government, in a different jurisdiction that is not Colorado, and that having so ruled that he committed this thing that is against federal law, which they have no jurisdiction over, in another jurisdiction, which they have no authority over, they are therefore applying the constitutional standard, not their constitution, the federal constitution, to bar him from not a state election, a federal election. That's like multiple layers of problems here. This ruling is a mess. And yeah, in lefty Colorado, they're going to get away with it on a state level. But I would be shocked if the Supreme Court doesn't just squash it. I mean, we'll see. Should be an interesting couple of weeks, more interesting than I was expecting. But at the end of the day, this is an example of lawfare. For those of you unfamiliar with the term, it's pretty simple. Using the legal system to punish your enemies. There's a reason why very few federal indictments go to trial because it's ludicrously expensive to fight the federal government, not least of which because they can afford to fight forever because they can fight for free. They get paid to go after you. That's why I think 1 or 2% of all federal indictments ever go to trial. Most of them get settled or dismissed. It's pretty easy to see that as, I'm a normal citizen. Let's say I had millions of followers instead of 5. Let's say I'm a highly influential voice and I just chose to say something critical about the government. So that puts me on the radar of someone who's politically motivated and is looking to collect a scalp so that they can get an appointment or a raise or whatever. And so the guns of the federal government turn on me and I get investigated. I'm a fairly law-abiding person, but I bet you could find something that's in violation of a federal statute. There's a lot of them. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the Federal Register is enormous. So let's say they find something that even arguably, forget being able to convict me, even arguably could be brought to bear against me. If that's the case, I can be indicted. And at that point, I either roll over and say, you win, you can take a few years of my life, you can take my money, you can take what you need, I'm not gonna fight this. Or I can try and fight it. The average cost for a defendant in the federal system is in the millions of dollars in legal fees. I don't have millions of dollars, I'm a regular person. But just because something I do gets me on the radar of the federal government, they can use lawfare to persecute me, to squash me. And if it's a matter of speech, then people who think and speak like I do are going to be more careful with what kind of things they say or what kind of things they do. It has a chilling effect on free speech. Scummy, but effective. And it doesn't even just have to be targeted at an individual, okay? The simple truth is you have a situation like this, where you have the institutions of government taking action to protect the institutions of government. And they can do a lot of stuff that's tricky and crazy and expensive and designed to increase their power. That's kind of the vibe I'm getting here. So this is Nathan Lindorf with The Rational Independent, and this was my Reddit rant today. Good luck out there.